Hello, my name is Tamika Clemens, and I teach at Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine. I am the course director for a molecular course as well as for metabolic foundations course. And I figured today's discussion could just center around overall metabolism. It's been a lot in the news about poor diet, diabetes, obesity, maybe taking in low carbs, more protein, and just wanted to provide an overarching idea of what those terms mean and give some scientific relevance to what happens, especially when that central molecule we know as glucose is broken down or taken in. Okay, and so I love to show this slide because it actually shows that the carbohydrate that's taken in from the diet goes and produces a molecule that is critical for the cell called glucose. And glucose can then go through a process of either glycolysis, and lysis meaning to break it down. So you're going to break down that glucose molecule and give us something we ultimately need in the body, which is energy, in the form of what we call ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Or in addition, that glucose molecule can be stored, at least some of it, in what we call a process of glycogenesis. So glycogen is the storage form of a glucose molecule, and glycogenesis is the process of making that glycogen molecule. And so it's illustrated here. You take in the carbohydrate from the diet. That glucose molecule is a product of what you take in from the diet, or one of the products, right? And from that, then it can either go through glycolysis, which means it's going to break down that molecule, and or if it's too much of the glucose and it doesn't need it for the energy output, it can actually then store it in the form of glycogen, and that's in the process known as glycogenesis. Now, let's talk a little bit about once it actually takes it and breaks it down into through the form of glycolysis. You'll end up with a molecule called pyruvate. Pyruvate is a critical molecule for the cell because pyruvate can go on to either decarboxylate, meaning it can lose a carbon dioxide molecule and give us something called acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is a molecule that can be used to actually form lipids. And so when we're talking about someone that has maybe a high carb diet and a low fat diet, oftentimes people think of a high carb diet and a low fat diet in terms of the fact that, well, at least I've decreased my fat intake. And what we need them to understand is you may have decreased your fat intake, but you've taken in more carbs. And those carbs can actually be converted into fat because of the product at the end of glycolysis called pyruvate can generate acetyl-CoA that can then go on to be used to actually make fat. So that's one of the critical components I wanted to mention. Another critical component is, what about the flip side of that? So you have people who decide that they're going to go on a fast, and so they're not going to eat for 12, 16 hours or even more, depending on what goal they think they want to achieve. And so, again, remember I mentioned that glucose molecule, if the body didn't need all of it to make energy, it will store some of it in the form of glycogen through a process called glycogenesis. Well, when you begin your fasting process, the body is then going to need to use that glucose, right? So it has to break that glycogen down through a process called glycogenolysis, right, to give you the glucose that your body would need so it can go through and make the pyruvate. But what happens when that glycogen store runs out? Right, because you've been fasting for more than like 12 to 16 hours and the glycogen storage runs out in usually that amount of time. But then your body is then going to have to rely on other things such as the breakdown of the lipids. So your triglycerides would go through a process of degradation through what we call lipolysis, breakdown of lipids. And it can give you fatty acids, and it can also give you glycerol. So if we're talking about giving you fatty acids, right, those fatty acids can go on to make something called ketones. This may be a term that you're not exactly familiar with in terms of the word ketone, but you may have heard of a ketogenic diet. And a ketogenic diet simply means that you're going to have a diet that's going to generate ketones, which means that's a diet that has more fat, right, and less carbohydrate. Okay, the Other component, though, that you have to remember about triglycerides is that it also gives you glycerol, right? Glycerol can actually go through a series of enzymes to get you back to glucose, right? So if you have glycerol, it can actually be converted through a dehydrogenase process after it's phosphorylated to glycerol 3-phosphate to actually give you something called dihydroxyacetone phosphate that is part of the glycolysis pathway, and also can be used for gluconeogenesis. So it's critical to begin to understand that the carbohydrate pathway and the lipid pathway are interrelated, and you cannot necessarily just cease taking in one, and think that is not going to affect the other pathway. They're much so interrelated. Along with that is we hear a lot about proteins, and when you're talking about proteins, right, the building block for that is amino acids. And so those proteins that you take in can get metabolized, so broken down to the amino acids, and if you're in a starvation state, your body will begin to do that. That is something that we don't like to go to, because then it can lead to muscle weakness and other problems as well. So I just want to provide you again an overview of some terms that you should become familiar with, even as a layperson, that will help you when you're thinking about how is this being metabolized in my body. And again, those terms are glycolysis, which is the breakdown of glucose. And glucose is that main carbohydrate that your body has as a result of taking in carbs from the diet. You have glycogenesis, which is once your body takes in those carbohydrates and it doesn't need all of them to produce ATP, it can store some in the form of glycogen. If it needs to use it, it can break down that glycogen in a process called glycogenolysis. Okay, and then of course there's lipolysis, which is the breakdown of your lipids, which your body will begin to use if it needs it in terms of an energy source, because you're either on a fast or starving, or you've taken in less of a particular metabolic compound that your body needs. The ultimate goal, though, is that your body needs to be in homeostasis, especially in terms of energy. And so the whole point of eating is that we understand that we need to get energy for the body. And we hear of that in terms of calories, and keeping in mind that the calories is directly correlated to energy molecules. And so you want to be mindful of just those key terms that will help you. Thank you for listening.